Today is May 6, 2021. My name is Enshi. I'm with the Houston Asian American Archive. Today, we're interviewing Rajiv Raghavan for the Houston Asian American Archive's Our History project about his life stories. Thank you so much, Rajiv, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for setting this up, Anne, and thank you for having me.
Great. To start, can you tell us where and when were you born?
Yeah, sure. I was born in 1979. I was born in Corning, New York, which is in upstate New York. It was remember a cold time because the winters in upstate New York extend well past March and April, which is when I was born in March. And so, yeah, I was born there. My parents had moved to the U.S. I think in 1973, thereabouts, and so. Um, Yeah, so that's where I was born. And then after that, we moved, when I was 4 years old, we moved to Richmond, Indiana, so in the Midwest. And we were there for about 6 years or so. And then my mom had come over and she decided to go back to school and get her bachelor's and master's. And so my brother and I went to India, where we lived with our grandparents for about 2.5 years. And then when we came back, we moved to Ohio, just south of Dayton, Ohio, a small in a suburb called Centerville. And that's kind of where I grew up for most of my time. And before coming to Houston, I'd spent most of my life in Ohio.
So, when you moved back to India from America for that brief 2.5 years, can you share some of the interesting stories? Like, was it strange for you?
Yeah, I mean, I remember it was strange at first. So I was there for third, fourth, and part of fifth grade. And so, of course, my brother and I, and definitely I could feel that I was a stranger there because everyone had grown up in India, and I was the only one coming there from the U.S. Into my class, and it was a different experience. And I think, the language was definitely is both English and Tamil. Tamil is the language in Chennai in South India, which is where we were living, and so I am not a native. I mean, I know Tamil, but I'm not as native a speaker. And so definitely the pronunciation made me stick out. The not wearing uniforms, I wasn't used to wearing uniforms in school. That made me stick out a little bit. And I think, it's just a little bit of getting used to. So I do remember it was a little bit of a transition period. But I will say living with my grandparents in hindsight was probably one of the most rewarding experiences that I've had. And the reason, for a lot of reasons, one is that we just don't have that quality time with our grandparents. Growing up in the U.S., I can see that we're very nuclear here, and we value our local family, our nuclear family, the extended family, which is something that's a little cultural in Asian communities, is not as commonplace here. And so, especially for us immigrant families, where many of our extended family lives across the world or even across the United States in different places, having that time in hindsight was really amazing. And so, yeah, so growing up there, my grandfather was a journalist, and my grandmother was not working, so she was home with us. And she actually passed away about 2 or 3 years after we had left there. So it made it extra special to have that time with her while she was still with us. Yeah, so besides school, my brother and I would. My grandfather was a journalist for the national paper, so we would so in his post he was a little bit of a prominent post, and so we would be able to spend vacation time in the mountains, and we would be able to go to the beach. We were somewhat affluent. In the mornings we would uh, it's the Saturday and Sunday morning, we would go to the beach in the morning and take walks on the ocean, and we had really a nice time. And so being at that age, my brother was 3 years younger than me. We both really enjoyed that experience.
That's wonderful. And do you remember some of the food that your grandparents have made you during that time?
Yeah, yeah. So growing up, we were in a vegetarian family, and so the typical typical meal for us would be a vegetable along with the rice and a bean, which is dal. So it's a lentil-based bean, and you mix everything together. And then after that, you'd have another dish with rice and with yogurt called tar sadam, and that along with the vegetable as well. And that was the main dish we used to have pretty much all the time. And sometimes we'd have what's called chapatis, which are basically like tortillas here. But you could do the same thing with it, dip it with the dal and dip it with the rice and dip it with, I mean, with the yogurt and the vegetables. And that was much of the meal. I think Western meals were just coming there at the time. I still remember the first Domino's that opened up, on down not that far away from us. And I remember having that pizza and thinking this tastes nothing like what I was used to eating back in the United States. But yeah, pretty traditional meals. Sweets were kind of a treat. We loved ice cream. I think Indians tend to love ice cream, and so I remember finishing a lot of meals and saving room for ice cream. And the Indian ice cream is just so delicious because it's so creamy, and so it was always a treat to have ice cream after the meals.
Do you think having that unique bonding with your Indian culture and your grandparents kind of impacted the shape and shaped your as who you are today?
I do. I think I speak the language more fluently because of my time there. Certainly, growing up here, I don't think I would have really been as fluent with the language. I think the culture, growing up, even after we came back to the United States, when my mom was working, we'd still go to India in the summers, and she would work in the school system, so she would have the summers off. So most of the summers, my brother and I, until we were, in high school, we would kind of ship off with my mom to India and spend a couple months there. And so having that connection with India, I think, really reinforced the culture, reinforced the language, and definitely made me appreciate more of what I have. Just going to a place where, people struggle a little bit more. I mean, you can see it; it's so crowded. There's, the housing is not as easy for many people, and people live in smaller places. And having maids, having so much help around, I think makes you appreciate a lot more of what you have. And I think that definitely impacted how I grew up and how my values are today.
And can you share with us some of the childhood games that you play?
Yeah. So in the U.S., of course, I was really, my parents made sure that we were into sports, and so I remember doing soccer pretty much as long as I could remember. It was a fall sport in Ohio, and so every fall my brother and I would be playing soccer, and then the winters we would try basketball. In spring we would do tennis, and my mom really pushed us into swimming, especially me. I had asthma growing up, and so really severe asthma, and I'd get asthma attacks. And so she had read somewhere that when you do swimming, you help your breathing quite a bit. And so she pushed me to swim kind of year round. And I ended up swimming all through high school, even on the high school team. And I think that really helped a lot. Um, Besides sports, as a family, we would do games like, Pictionary. Scrabble was pretty popular in our house. Trying to think what else. We weren't so much a card family. I mean, Uno, I think we'd play Uno as a family, but we weren't big into playing cards like my wife's family is. And tennis, once my brother and I both got into tennis, I remember a lot of weekends we would bike to the tennis courts and play tennis against one another. And so we had that outlet together.
How about back in India, were you kind of introduced during that 2.5 years, introduced to new local games that you weren't aware of when you were back in India, or when you were back in the US?
I think I was probably a little young to do it because this was third and fourth grade. And so in fifth grade, I think I remember playing cricket in the streets, right in front of our house. There was all the neighborhood kids would get together and we'd set up a cricket court. But I think I was probably really too young to really partake in that. I don't remember sports being as big a thing, at that time when I was in India, at least at my age, I'm sure.
Great, thank you. And next on to the chapter of your life in the US, did your parents kind of spoke of why they moved to the US?
So my father is an engineer, and in the 1970s, there was a big migration of Indians coming into the United States. I think I don't know affectionately or not, but it was called the brain drain, as you may have heard. Or ever heard the term. And so many professionals, doctors, engineers, the mathematicians, researchers really came over from India. And my father came over for graduate studies in Tulane in New Orleans. And at that time, it was common for a lot of graduate students to come over and study here. And many of my friends growing up, their parents also came over around the same time. And so at that time, he came for studies. And then after he finished his master's degree and got a job, he went back to India and had the arranged marriage with my mom. And then my mom came over with him. The rest is history. And so she had finished her bachelor's in India. And for her, I think she always wanted to be someone working and not be just, at home with the children. And so for her, it was a pretty big decision to send us to India so she could, complete her bachelor's and master's and go back to school. But I think for them, yeah, it was a big thing. And even at that time, for my mom to marry my father, it was culturally, it was, among that group, more educated group, it was a prestigious thing. Like, my dad's studying in the United States. He's going to work in the United States. Why don't you marry him and move over there to get a better life? And so I think it was always a preferred thing for women to marry into someone who's studying abroad and to come abroad.
Did it bring you up with any spirituality that, or kind of that backdrop of any religious views?
Yeah, we, I think they were open. I think they struggled with coming to the new country and how much of their old culture to adopt. And so definitely we grew up, and plus at that time, there were not many Indians. I mean, Indians were just coming over around that time. So I remember the big temple was in Pittsburgh, and that was the first temple in the United States, and it was a big, big deal. And so every year we would drive about 7 hours to go there. And it was fun to see other Indian kids and to see people who looked like you. And then we'd go back to our small town in Richmond, Indiana, where, we were probably the only Indians or one of very few Indians in that town. And people, didn't looked at you different and they didn't ask a lot of questions and so on and so forth. So we had that spirituality at home, but of course we didn't have that group like a church or anywhere where you could go on a regular basis. By the time we moved to Ohio, this was in the 1990s, the community was a lot bigger and there was a temple there. And so growing up, we would go to the temple once or twice a month, typically Saturdays, Sundays, and we would mingle with other kids. We would take some of the classes to learn about mythology and about spirituality and Hinduism. And of course, my dad and mom were a little more involved and they would take some leadership roles within the community. And I think that helped kind of foster that sense. But I think still to this day, I don't know if it's as rooted in the sense that we knew that there was spirituality, but I think my parents still wanted us to be more worldly and to learn about other cultures, and that we weren't so centric within the Hinduism view. And so I still have this view where I believe in kind of the big picture of spirituality, but not really central to one particular ethos. And I think that really comes from my parents being more accepting of other religions and other practices.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And you spoke of the town Richmond doesn't have a lot of diversity. Can you share with us what are kind of the demographics like over there, and what was their religious demographics like as well?
Yeah, so Richmond is a small town, or at least in the 70s, the 80s when I was there, and I'm sure it still is today, but it's between Indianapolis, which is the large city in Indiana, and Dayton, which is the closest city right across the border in Ohio. And it's about 1 hour equidistant between those two kind of larger cities. And so it was a small town. Certainly, there was a couple factories there. I think one was a fiberglass producing factory, insulation, which is where my dad worked, called Manville. And it was, fairly working class town, definitely predominantly white. I know, even looking back at my old yearbooks from that time, I know for sure that we were one of the only Indian families there. And so I know growing up, I still remember that I'd get a lot of questions, and my mom, when she would walk around in her sari or her ethnic outfits, I would be a little embarrassed and a little shy about my background because I wanted to fit in so much with the other people around. But I imagine that the majority of people there were probably Christian and going to church, and that was just the way of life.
As you were talking about that, that reminded me of the TV series Never Had I Ever. In
Oh
case
yeah.
that,
Uh-huh.
yeah. So what do you think of it? Does that kind of resonate with your upbringing experiences?
Yeah, actually, it really did. I don't think we finished the whole series, but we definitely watched a few episodes, and yeah, it was pretty interesting to watch. And I think nowadays a lot of the TV series that even my children watch that have Indian characters, they have some of the same backgrounds and beliefs. And I don't know if my children, being I guess third generation, how they feel, if they feel the same way. But yeah, definitely, I agree. The stereotype.
Yeah, and moving on to your school life, what were your favorite subjects back then? And can you share with us some of your memories in school?
Yeah, I mean, I think growing up, now moving more into where I was in Ohio, which is really where I spent most of my time. I really, I think, had a fondness for math and science and biology. And I think, my parents coming here and my dad being in the engineering discipline, I think sure had a big influence on that. And so I tended to like those. I really liked all of school. I mean, I remember I didn't miss a day of high school. I loved going to school. I enjoyed learning. And so I enjoyed reading. I liked language. Honestly, I really think I liked everything. And so it was a little bit of a difficult decision, kind of deciding on what to study. And I had a lot of options finishing high school on what to do. And um, even to this day, I still feel like I'm fairly well rounded. I really like learning about a lot of things and studying different things.
That's wonderful. And have you had any like sports that you were excelling in during the school life?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest for me, music was the strongest discipline. So I started the cello in I think end of around fifth grade when we came back from India, and it was before most of the schools actually had cello within the school. In the middle school, there was school orchestra here, and so when I started middle school, I'd already had lessons in the cello, and so I was ahead of my peers, and I think that really helped make me more interested in the music because I was already, sitting in the front and playing solos and already ahead of everyone else. And so that was really what I continued. And all throughout middle school and high school here, I would play not just with the school, but with the local city youth orchestras. And I would, do competitions. And that was what I really excelled the most in. And not surprisingly, when I started college, I actually started off as a music major and wanted to study in music. Within sports, I really, tennis and swimming were my main two sports, and continued those throughout high school, and was able to get varsity letter in high school, though I would say I was not the best in either one. I was certainly good enough to make the team, but not always the most excelling in those sports. But I think as far as the career goes, somewhere I think around ninth grade, so maybe when I was 14 or 15, I had this, I think, personality that was more gentle and more caring. And so my mom had in the back of my mind that maybe you should consider a career in medicine. And we did not have obviously any physicians in the family. And so it was interesting to think about that. And so she kind of pushed me to shadow some of the local doctors, other Indians in the community who were physicians. And so I would do that. I would take my cello and go play at the nursing home and play for patients just so that I could learn a little bit more about what it's like to be taking care of other people. And so I think around 16, I decided that that's what I wanted to do for my career.
That's wonderful, and I think I mean, just from my knowledge, that the Texas Medical Center is also having some musical events in the lobby of the hospitals, which is
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, so kind of going from music to medicine, like as your passion kind of shifts, did you feel like as of now you have any like regrets of shifting that career path?
No, not at all, actually. I really, the two complement one another in the sense that, the music is an outlet for medicine. I think a lot of my colleagues who I still play with, so I play in the Texas Medical Center Orchestra here, and I've done a lot of other collaborations with other people in healthcare who are also musicians. And I think it's nice that I have the outlet. And I think the obviously the other alternative would have been to be a musician foremost as a first career, since I started college as a music major, and I'd even at the end of high school was contemplating going to a full music school to study music with some of the great teachers. But I think the lifestyle of being in medicine and being a physician, and the salary, and of course is a little bit better than a musician, and it would have been a lot harder to earn a living as a musician. And so I think I love music and I'm passionate about it, but I don't think one was passionate enough to make it my first career. And I enjoy that I can still do music even having a career in something else.
Was there like a kind of a trigger or a turning point, or like when you were kind of in that moment of decision?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, as finishing high school, I had a lot of different interests, as I mentioned, and so the three colleges I remember looking at, one was a music school. It was in Baltimore, called the Peabody Conservatory, and it was a very rigorous music school. I mean, the people, it's like Juilliard or any of the top music schools, and it was really aimed towards turning out musicians. And I'd met with them, and they had the option where I could take pre-medical classes at the local university, and so I could still be a musician but do this on the side. And then the other school I was looking at was actually the Air Force Academy in Colorado, which was not so much musical. Really, it was just more of it was a good place to train. And of course, doing in the military, I could almost get into medical school, like almost a guaranteed path to medical school with the certain grades and whatnot. And so the third one I looked at was in Ohio, in Cleveland, called Case Western, and that's where I ended up selecting. And I was able to do music through the Cleveland Institute of Music, which is a really great music school there, and still get my degree from Case Western. And so it really seemed the best of both worlds, because I could do music and also still get a degree from a very top institution. And while I was there, I was even part of the ROTC, which is the Air Force Junior Training Course. So I was able to go there and really mix all these three places together. And so it made the decision fairly easy. Interestingly, during the first semester of school, I was in music class, and the teacher asked us to sing out loud in front of all the students a piece of music. And I hate singing. I'd never sang before, and I was so nervous, and I really hated it. And so I was afraid that for the next 4 years, I would be having to do this more often. And so the next day, I remember going and changing my major. I said, I don't want to be a music major. I just want to play in the orchestra while I'm there. And I switched to chemical engineering right away. And so I ended up studying chemical engineering while I was there and doing pre-medical classes as well.
Yeah, that's amazing that you're able to kind of weave so many different skills and passion in your life into your own life history. And I'm also curious, why did you decide to choose internal medicine and then nephrology?
Yeah, internal medicine is, I just is very broad discipline. So within the medical field, once you finish medical school, you get to choose what you want to do for the rest of your career. And it was a hard decision for me because I really loved all my rotations. I loved obstetrics quite a bit. I loved delivering babies, and I loved surgery. Of course, I didn't like the long hours and being stuck in the operating room, but I enjoyed being able to do something with my hands. And pediatrics, I knew I didn't want to do pediatrics, but I liked really a lot of the disciplines. And so internal medicine was very broad, and I knew I could join that. And when I was in internal medicine, I knew that it was just so broad that I wanted to be a specialist in something else. I didn't want to just be such a broad general physician. And so I think nephrology appealed to me because the patients that we took care of, some of them were very sick, and we would see them in the intensive care unit, and others were really not as sick, and you could see them in clinic, and you could have this good relationship with patients. You would see them for the rest of their life. And I enjoy the chemistry. I mean, nephrology is a lot of sodiums and potassiums, and being a chemical engineer background, I think that appealed to me a little bit as well. And so I think those things really helped me decide on nephrology, and just watching some of the nephrologists in the training program and how they were able to make diagnosis and how they were, really humanistic as well as very cerebral. I think that appealed to me as well. And so I ended up choosing nephrology, and I trained at Baylor in the medical center, and ended up just staying on for my fellowship training after residency. And then I've really been at Baylor for the last 11 years. And so even after finishing, I just decided to stay on as a faculty position. And this June, I'll be moving out of Baylor actually for the first time in almost 20 years. And so it's um, it's been a long road here. I really love the medical center. I love Baylor. It's been a great place to train, of course, and a great place to work. Um, and excited for just trying something new in the next month or two.
Yeah, I understand you're taking a graduate course at the University of Houston. Is that the reason you're moving on?
Yeah, partly, yeah. So 2 years ago, I started a master's program in education. I think since starting my career at Baylor, I really loved teaching, and focused my teaching on students, on residents, on fellows, really all phases, nurses, pretty much anybody. And I think that's the part of my job. Of course, I love patient care, which is most of what I do, but teaching, preparing curriculums, giving lectures, speaking, I enjoy that a lot. And so 2 years ago, I decided to take on a master's in education because I think that is something that was lacking from my portfolio. And in doing so, in October, there was a job opening with the University of Houston with the residency training program, which is going to be up in North Houston. And so it really just sent in my CV. I met with them. I had no intention of leaving. I just wanted to really explore the option a little bit more. And I think as I learned more about it, I realized that this is a kind of once in a lifetime opportunity. It's a brand new medical school. It's a brand new residency program. I can really design what I want the learners to learn as opposed to being at Baylor where things were kind of set up. I mean, there's definitely things you can do here that are different, but you wouldn't have this kind of opportunity to really build something new and I think as you get older, you want to leave some legacy behind. And that's what I'm hoping this will be, is that this will be a program that I can start and, always have this as something wonderful that I've done for the city.
Yeah, that's amazing. And from the HAA, we are also honored to be being able to document and sharing your legacy. And I'm also curious, comparing teaching and doing surgical tasks in your professional career. How do you compare the two? Does the two like complement one another in your job?
They do. I think when you teach, you have to, whether you're teaching procedure skills or you're teaching patient care at the bedside or you're teaching in a lecture hall, you need to really follow the same steps, which is knowing who your audience is, knowing what they need to know, knowing how much time you have to teach, and finding out where you can teach and how you can teach it. For example, at the bedside of a patient, sometimes you can teach in front of the patient and point out certain physical exam findings on the patient, a rash or an abnormal sound in the heart. But other times, you may have to step away and do that teaching outside the patient's room. And I think those things complement one another. And so being an educator in healthcare, it is a lot about not just teaching and being passionate about it, but knowing how to teach and the most effective way to teach a group of learners. And I think that's something that really complements one another, regardless of where you are.
That's wonderful. And I guess moving on to a little bit of your personal side, I see that you have been married. Can you share with us a little bit about how you met your wife?
Yeah. So my wife grew up in Saudi Arabia, and she's also Indian origin. Her parents are from South India, but they're from another state in South India. And so she grew up, although she was Indian, she grew up in a different, her family is from a different state. They're Christian instead of Hindu, and they speak a different language than my parents do, or what I grew up speaking. They speak Malayalam. And so we, um, we both met during college. We were both at Case Western. So we met almost the first day of school, age 18. And we'd really been together this whole time. And so throughout college, on and off, but mostly on. And once went to medical school, I started medical school in Ohio because I was a state resident. And it's very easy when you're a state resident to get into the school in your state. And she was a Texas state resident. And so she came to Baylor. And we did long distance relationship for a couple of years. And once we decided that this is we want to make it work, I had transferred down to Baylor, and so finished my medical school at Baylor and stayed on since. And so we both have really been here in Houston since about 2003 together, so almost 20 years. And she's also a physician. She works in anesthesiology, and we had our first child in 2009, and then again 2012 and 2017. So we have three children now, and we really enjoy being parents. We enjoy, we have of course, us growing up from 18 onwards, we have a lot of similarities, and our personalities fit very well. It wasn't so much of an adjustment because we kind of grew up together, so to speak, and so we enjoy socializing. I think we both enjoy having friends over, or going out to the park and meeting people and interacting a lot. So many of our weekends we end up inviting people or going to people's houses and getting together. Um, we both play tennis. We have a lot of similarities in the sense that we both our families are Indian, so of course the cultural background is important. And um, so we've gone to India several times. We've gone back with our children. We enjoy going back to India and teaching our children about the Indian culture. She cooks very well, and so she cooks Indian food at home. Um, the big difference would be that culturally, even though we're both Indian and we look similar, we have the same skin color and everything, we both grew up speaking different languages. And so we have not really taught our kids consciously any of the languages, my language or hers. And I think growing up, because I grew up Hindu and she grew up Christian, we're raising the children as Christians, but the church that they go to is predominantly a Western church. And so the kids are growing up knowing some Indian children in the church, but the majority of people in the church are, white, or they grew up in this country without that different background of being Indian. So it's an interesting time. I think our kids definitely identify as Indian, and we look Indian, and having both the parents Indian makes them feel very Indian. But a lot of their friends really aren't Indian, in the sense that growing up for me and for my wife, our parents' generation really did mingle more with Indians. And so our dinner parties as a child and hers similarly were mostly with Indian families. And a lot of our friends growing up were of Indian origin.
Do you think what your children in their third generation experiences and your own experiences as a second generation about a few decades ago would have changed very much? Like, how would you compare the generational experiences in diaspora as Indians in diaspora here?
Yeah, I think it's different. I do think that second generations have more of a um, connection with India or with where their parents came from. I think that for a lot of reasons, I think the culture is stronger, the language may be stronger, the values of course are still there, but the values were stronger before, the work hard mentality, the focus on the sciences, the um, kind of the very traditional type of learning. And moving forward, I think it's a little different. Of course, we do try and impart some of the cultures and the values um, to our children, but I think as they grow up in the United States and uh, our third generation, the connection to India is definitely less than it was before. And I think that's normal. I think that's part of assimilation, part of moving in with the new cultures, that you your identity is a little bit different. You may identify more as American than Indian, whereas I still myself feel that I would say I'm more of an Indian American than I guess an American Indian, or vice versa. So I think my children have more of that. We of course try and put some of our values with the children, but I know that we're not. They don't see from us the type of struggles that myself or my parents of coming here, going through school while while my brother and I were young, uh, coming and not knowing anybody in a foreign country, and going back, and all of that I think is not going to be there, and that's going to affect how they grow up.
Yeah, totally. Um, and I'm also curious, since you mentioned your parents were arranged marriage, and have they kind of had discussions with you regarding your marriage, which sounded like it was non-arranged since you guys met in college. Like, you and your parents have kind of sometimes disagreement or challenges in that topic?
Yeah, it's been so I think growing up, we really did not have much discussion. I think in traditional that generation, dating was not something that we discussed openly, and so I really did not have much experience with dating and meeting girls while I was in my parents' house. And though we did things a little behind the back, it wasn't as open discussion. And so I think when I met my wife at a young age, and we knew it was serious, there was definitely some disagreement once my parents knew that we were planning to get married, and she has a different background, a different religion, from a different part of India. And so I think their concerns, looking back now, is one is that how are you going to raise your children? How are you going to instill in these same cultures when you have someone from a different background? And that struggle was certainly there even through the early part of our marriage. Um, my brother, he actually did have more of a traditional arranged marriage. He certainly, his wife also grew up in the United States, but same background, same religion, same culture. And so the parents had introduced the two, and they decided to get married on their own. But it was more of a modern arranged marriage, so to speak, as compared to my wife and I. And so I think the struggles are there. I'm sure they still are there. Things may be a little bit better today than they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago between my parents and my wife. But, I think that's probably to be expected. And I think moving forward, it's probably helped me, because when my children come to that age, I think we'll be more tolerant and more accepting of who they choose.
Um, do you think, if I can kind of probe deeper, like which one works better, the arranged or the non-arranged way?
Yeah, I don't know. It depends. I guess it really depends on how you define works better. I think the arranged marriage has worked well um, for most of the generations ahead of us. And I would say for that generation and for generations and generations before them, the couples tend to stay together more. The divorce rate is low. I think the values are similar, and so the children grow up with similar type of values with respect to how they treat others, the focus on the grandparents accepting extended families, the taking care of elders, all those kind of traditional values that are maybe Asian as we think of them. Um, and I think that's great. But of course, the downside is that my parents don't always have the same similarities. My mom loves to exercise and to work out, and I think she would have liked if my dad was more into physical sports, because then they could go play tennis together or go play other kind of sporting activities together. I think personality, my mom is maybe more social than my dad is, and so things like that. Both aren't going to always be there. Whereas with my wife and I think we have a pretty good relationship in the sense that we really like a lot of the same things. But I don't know if one is necessarily better than the other.
Yeah, thank you very much for indulging me with that answer. And I'm also curious with your professional life. You have achieved tremendously as your like the word certificates behind you, and your resume is like amazing. Can you share with us a little bit about your perspectives on kind of consider the model minority, as like we Asians are like a lot of the times labeled that kind of label.
Oh, you mean as overachievers in the
Like very successful immigrants and the model minority. Like, do you what are your thoughts, and if you identify with that label?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's a couple reasons. I mean, I think a large part of it is genetics. If you think about who migrated over, it's really not the people who the people that came over as professionals. They were already hardworking, and I think it goes without saying that to be the best in India, or to be the best in China, or to be the best in any other country is a lot harder than it is in the United States. There's a lot more competition for fewer spots, and um, so I think it's over time the people that came over already had a little bit easier time of learning how to study, learning how to excel in the maths and the sciences and the other disciplines. So I think we had that, and on top of that, of course, the culture of your parents coming over and working hard, and I think that's there in my parents' generation with me and my parents. And I think my kids also see that because both of us are physicians. We work long hours. I'm in school right now, and so my kids have seen me come home and do my classes, and so I think they'll also have that work ethic that life doesn't end at a certain time. I mean, you have to keep learning, keep being in school, keep furthering yourself. Volunteering to lead things and to be a community leader. And I think that's propelled me a lot in my career, is that I want to take on responsibilities. I want to do the best. And now that I'm above age 40 and kind of hitting that middle of my career, I'm now thinking more about what I want to leave behind and what I want to focus the next 15 to 20 years on. And that's where I think the idea of legacy is. And, I think it's natural that where I am today, I know that where I want to be in 15 to 20 years, and kind of what I want to be remembered for after I retire, and maybe even after I'm gone. And I think a lot of that is just, it takes time to build up. It takes effort. It takes that pushing yourself to do this, to have that vision of where you want to be. Um, and I hope that my kids see that, and they'll also get to this point where they want to excel at everything and take on new responsibilities, and see how they can be the best in their particular field.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. And I'm not sure since your kids are probably still relatively young, but have you had any kind of discussions with their identity in terms of as they're in their Indian kind of origin and cultural heritage, in terms of um, how to identify themselves and so on?
Yeah, I think we Do we? So my in-laws live in Houston, and my wife's parents are here, and my parents visit from Ohio and may move back here soon. I move to Houston soon. So in that sense, when we get together once a week or so as a family, we are typically enjoying an Indian meal of Indian food. We celebrate some of the holidays, and in those turn, we wear traditional Indian clothes. My children all have a drawer full of Indian outfits that are there. And when the school does the international days, they're always representing their country of India. And so they have this connection with India, and they've been back there a few times, but of course it's nothing like me growing up where we would go for months at a time. When we go back now because of our work schedules, we go for 2 weeks, and it's different. And of course we go every few years instead of every year, and so they may not have the connection with India, and I can totally see that maybe when they're older they may not even go back to India, uh, except maybe to visit on a holiday once or twice in their life. So that culture is still there, that the love for the food, the identification of being an Indian is there with the children. But I think that's something that is apart from the country of India as the place to be in. Um, and I think that's expected. I expect my children may not identify as fully as Indian. They may identify more as American. They may not marry someone who's of Indian origin. They, certainly their children may less likely have some of the Indian cultures and values that we do, or that we're trying to instill in them.
Yeah, I'm also curious since you mentioned that there were moments probably that you kind of slightly felt rejecting the Indian culture as like parents wearing the traditional Indian garments, Indian costumes, whereas do you see that at some point your children have also had that kind of discussions with you?
I think so. Skin color is always a big thing with the younger kids. And so the younger ones, and even my 4-year-old, she's always, talking about her brown skin and why it's not white skin. And of course, when you see the movies or the TVs and you see the princesses, and I have all daughters. And so I think that is probably the first thing that they think of. Um, but as they get older, my 12-year-old, I think she's very accepting and, of course, very proud of her background. And when she has her friends who are Indian, they have something in common that it's hard to describe in words. But when she has her friends who are non-Indian versus those who are Indian, I think there's some connection between her and her friends who are Indian that just has to do with the fact that the culture is a little bit different. I mean, the culture is a little bit of the same. And so I think that tends to happen as the kids get a little bit older.
That's really interesting, and thank you for sharing that. And next, I'm also curious, what are some of the communities in Houston that you're part of?
So we are part of a church community, and it's a large church, predominantly Caucasian, white, and it's an open-minded church. And so our kids have grown up there, being baptized and being part of the youth group, the choirs, and I think it's a community that definitely I enjoy being a part of. We're very involved with their activities, and so I've sports, for example. I've coached numerous soccer teams for my children, and so whenever they're part of sports, of course, not only are we participating by showing up and cheering them on, but often take on leadership roles within that as well. Um, and I think my older one has been part of the Scouts for a few years, and so I've taken on some roles within the Scouts organization as well. Specifically with regards to Asian organizations within the community, we really don't have as much of an affiliation with any of them. And I think part of it is where we live. We live closer to Rice University, closer to more where there's not as many Indians. And of course, we know the Indians where we live, but it's not in a neighborhood that we have so many Indians around us. And of course, I think not going to a temple, not having that religious affiliation also makes it less likely for us to be part of an Indian organization or an Indian group where we're regularly meeting with other Indians and Indian children. And I would say part of that is probably done on purpose in the sense that my wife, and me too, but more so with my wife, I think she wants to assimilate more with the culture here and really not only fraternize with people that look similar.
I see. Thank you for sharing that. And next, we're gonna shift gears a little bit to the moments we're in, the pandemic of 2020. So how have you been since and how has the pandemic impacted your lifestyle?
We've been very fortunate for a lot of reasons. I mean, of course, health is the first thing, and second is employment. Being in healthcare, we've been working the whole time. In fact, maybe even working more during the pandemic, and so I think those things have. We've been very fortunate to have our health and to be still working and enjoying the same level of lifestyle. The children, of course, I think they may react in different ways, but we have always pushed our children to get back to school sooner than later. So our kids have actually been in school pretty much all year long, in-person classes, and so they've been, of course, wearing the mask and doing the distancing, but they're at least back with friends, and it feels almost like normal. I think so for them. So I think the pandemic has been something that we've grown from as a family. Of course, we've spent more time together. We've really not mingled as much with others, at least the last 8 or 9 months, as we used to. So we've gotten a little bit closer. We've become more of a nuclear family, and that's been really nice. Um, but at the same time, I think we are not maybe as isolated as other people are or have been for all these reasons because we're really not home. I mean, we're both in work and we're both the kids are all in school, so some of that has really not changed.
And has 2020, where the social justice events such as the death of George Floyd and the amount of anti-Asian hate crimes, which is actually has extended to this year and is still rising, like has it changed your opinions around advocacy for like racial justice courses?
I think it's made me more aware of these issues. I think that these issues have always been here. I don't think any of these are new issues. And growing up in the '90s when there was the riots in Los Angeles after Rodney King, and the anti-Asian and anti-African Americans and Black, all of these injustices that have always been there. And of course, growing up, I remember actually in Indiana, that was one of the homes of the KKK was close to where we were. That was like the central headquarters. And so learning what the Ku Klux Klan were and how they were really white supremacist organization, I kind of learned that at a young age, just growing up in Midwestern, away from a big city like Houston, where you walk around and you see people of different color and different backgrounds every single day. Um, so I don't think that a lot of this is new, but I do value that this is coming to the forefront now. And I think that there's a lot that we can do as a society to make things better. And of course, the first thing is to have this open dialogue and to have this. So as the events have unfolded, we've had conversations with really our older children. We have a 12-year-old and 9-year-old who are more aware of some of these issues and what they are. And so I think that they know a little bit more about what's going on, how important it is to understand the kind of privilege that we have having this pedigree of people who valued education and valued employment. And not everyone starts from the same place. It's a lot harder to move up in this society than it is to maintain your status quo. and of course the views of the discriminatory views of people who look different from you and uh, lashing out at them, we definitely tell them that that's not right and point out examples. So that I think we're doing the best we can for us, and hopefully they get a lot of this at school too. I know my sixth grader is learning about a lot of this in her classes, and they're having open discussions, and certainly my third grader as well. So it's coming not just from us but from their school.
That's wonderful to hear. And I'm also wondering if you personally have been like kind of experienced any of these racial injustice, like either as the target or the kind of a passing, like a bystander, and in terms of like witnessing these events.
I think I know I have. Certainly, if I dig back in my history, I know I've been called names before, especially when I was younger. I mean, growing up and uh, when children were mean and they taunted you, and of course, I think all kids experience that if they were obese or if they looked funny or if they had anything different. Of course, that was part of teasing. And of course, for me, my teasing included teasing because of the way you look, the way you dressed, where you're from. And so that was always there. But to be honest, I think my personality was that it didn't really affect me so much. And I think now, taking a lot of classes on these microaggressions and learning about, that it's not okay necessarily to ask people where they're from, um, even if they look different. I think I was always asked that, and I never paid any attention to it. It didn't bother me like it maybe bothers other people. They look different. They don't want to be asked where you're from because they grew up in the United States just like anyone else. But to me, I would always just answer we're from India and kind of give the explanation that the person asking it may have expected to hear. But now with a lot of the political correctness that I'm learning at work and learning in the media, that these things are really not supposed to be asked nowadays. And so I think to answer your question, it definitely I've felt it. Of course, not to the extent of the individuals that you read about and hear about in the news. Um, but I'm also, it's something that I don't dwell on, and it doesn't really bother me as much if people say anything to me. You can only control what you believe, and you cannot. There's always going to be small-minded people out there, and there's nothing you can do about that.
Yeah, that's totally true. And I'm also curious. I didn't kind of ask this question back when we were talking about your childhood, but I'm wondering what was the first moment that you kind of felt that you were different and understood that you were different from the people around you?
Um, I think I mean the name is probably the first thing. Anytime you first go to school and you have to say your name and pronounce it, and why can't your name be Fred or John or Joseph? Um, that's the first thing. And so, of course, having the name, and then second thing is just looking different, having darker skin, black hair. Uh, you're different, and when you go to a room and you're the only one who looks a certain way, it is going to be there. It's maybe in the back of your mind. It may not be that people point it out to you, but of course you're going to feel naturally that way. And so I would say the first time this happened was probably when you first went to school in kindergarten and they had trouble saying your name and would kind of ask you, oh, where are you from? Where are your parents from? And I mean, that's the question that most immigrants will always get right away.
I'm also wondering, do you name your children Indian names or in like American names?
So we, because they're raised Christian, we decided to name them Indian first names, but then give a Christian middle name for them. And it was a decision that we, of course, thought a lot about before we did that. And in hindsight, I'm very happy we did that. That they have Indian first names. And of course, my wife is happy they have Christian middle names. And so I think we have a good compromise with that.
That's wonderful. And I guess as we are approaching the hour and want to also be mindful of your time, do you have anything that I haven't covered that you would like to be documented in your life history interview?
Let me see, I printed the sheet out. I guess the other big thing to just document is that it was always a little confusing. So the term Asian, whether or not I'm Asian is always something that's been a question. I think the fact that growing up in the 1980s and 90s, here, the term Indian, of course, the younger children associate that with Native Americans. And so when you say you're Indian, um, people don't necessarily know. Of course, the parents and older people may know that you're from the Indian subcontinent. And so the term Indian was a little bit confusing. And I think now it's more commonplace to say Native Americans than Indians. And so that's kind of set out now. But then the term Asian oftentimes doesn't necessarily include people from India. When you think of Asian, a lot of times the thought is that people who are from the other countries that are in the Asian subcontinent, whereas not the Indian subcontinent itself. And so that's something that I don't know what the right answer is. Of course, when we check the boxes on any application, there's a box for Asian, and I always identify myself as Asian. But when you read the news, and of course you're hearing a lot of this violence and these actions against Asians, they're really not talking about Indians. They're talking about a different group of Asians that I may identify with at some level, but I really don't know if that term includes me. As an Indian, someone from Indian origin.
Thank you. And I'm also wondering if you would like to leave a message for your children and your children's children and so on, and the future generations.
Oh, that's the putting on the spot. I think it's important for our future generations to remember the sacrifice of all immigrants, and I think that's an important lesson that is easy to read about, but future generations may not experience that. And it definitely is something that the immigrant story of coming with very little amount and working hard and making something of yourself is a story that future generations, at least my children and their children's children, are not going to appreciate because we are already growing up in, my children are growing up in a family that's very affluent, a two-physician family. We value education. We can afford vacations. We can afford a home in a nice neighborhood. We can afford almost anything. And growing up, any immigrant will tell you the same thing, is that they did not always have that. And even though my parents had professions, of course, they had nothing like the lifestyle we have. We use coupons, we still look twice at bills, going out to eat, things like that. And so I think the message I would just say is that future generations should always look at immigrants and look at their story, because there's a lot of sacrifice in leaving your home, leaving your country, and coming somewhere new. And the immigrant story always involves working hard and making something of yourself. And as we always say, is to know who you are today, you need to appreciate where you came from. And I think for that reason, this is an important story to tell. And I hope all future generations will remember that no matter what generation you are, you have to remember that your story began with people who left their home and came to a country with almost nothing and had to make something of themselves.
Yeah, that's truly inspiring, and we're really honored to be witnessing this life legacy project with you, and being able to document your life history that has contributed so much to a country that is made up of immigrants. And yeah, and I'm sure your future generations will benefit from that totally. So thank you so much, Reggie, for sharing this hour with me.
Sounds good. Thank you for including me, and enjoy the rest of your day.